Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Orkin. I'm a researcher at the Center for the Study of African Economies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the final session of our Labor Day as part of the CSAE Conference 2021. Before I hand over to our chair, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Samir and Kara from the CSAE conference team, who've been doing an amazing job managing all of the tech. It's been super smooth, so thank you so much for all of your help. Also to introduce two of our the people at the CSAE Mind and Behavior Research Group. So we've been running the sessions today with a stream that does behavioral economics in the center. So it's great to be in charge of this session. Marta Grabowska is one of the junior researchers at the team in our team. With interests in health, economics, and political economy. And so she's going to be helping with this session. Thank you to her. And also to Julia Oceania, who presented in the agriculture session yesterday, but also has exciting work on education and human capital. So thanks to them for tweeting and managing the questions. And then to introduce our chair for the panel is Yasmine Bekkouche. She's just come to the center as a postdoctoral research fellow, having done her PhD at the Paris School of Economics. So it's great to have her with us. She's got work in education, in human capital, and then also looking at the dynamics between children, women, and men in the household, including intimate partner violence. So we've got a great final session on shocks in the labor market and their effects. With three great speakers so far, so we're really looking forward to the rest of the session. Thank you so much for joining us.
So thanks a lot, Kate, for this presentation, and thank you for all the CSAE team. We will begin with Sam Jones. He's a Uniwider Research Fellow, also an Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen, and he will present his work on the effect of peer salary information on own earnings forecast. So Sam, I leave you the floor.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just find the presentation. I hope you can see it. Great. So, good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning, or wherever you are. I'm very pleased to be able to present this work on updating expectations of the effect of peer salary information on future own earnings beliefs, which is joint work with Ricardo Santos and has very much enjoyed collaboration with Universidade Eduardo Mondlane here in Mozambique and the Labour Market Observatory of the Ministry of Labour. Time is short, so allow me to go in dig in as quickly as possible. So what motivates this study? So a lot of search theory in labor market economics tends to assume that prospective workers are relatively well informed about the distribution of salaries and cognitively unbiased. So they make relatively unbiased decisions. The empirical evidence on this, however, largely from developed countries, suggests otherwise. At the same time, there's also very little evidence on how job seekers actually respond to new information. And that's particularly relevant in the context of Mozambique, where the formal labor market is thin and there is very little kind of public information about salaries and wage opportunities and so on. And there's also other literature that suggests that individuals may not respond fully to new information. So optimistic beliefs, for example, can be quite sticky. So in this study, what we're focusing on is how do graduate job seekers in Mozambique respond to information about graduate earnings. And just to flag here that this is slightly different to some standard kind of information experiments where one might provide an unconditional information or an average for the entire population. This is looking at kind of more targeted information that I'll describe in a bit. And secondly, which relates to that point, is does the type of information matter? Does it matter what kind of information is provided? And in this paper, we focus on changes in expectations over time. And we see this as a first order response. If expectations of own earnings don't change, then it's unlikely that other behavioral responses will ensue. Okay, so just a little bit of background on how one can go about thinking about this. So as in other literature, particularly on prices and other kind of expectations updating type analyses. So we look at the difference between an information signal, here X, and a prior belief about that signal or a related signal, W, here at T-1. So the standard way of thinking of this is a kind of an updating towards signal model where we where we model the current belief, so here at T+1, as a function of the prior belief and the new signal. Now in laboratory experiments, this is all very well and good because in laboratory experiments you would experimentally manipulate over a relatively short space of time the information signal, and the rest is just noise. In the real world, of course, over longer periods of time, there's a lot of other sources of information that are relevant. So we can extend the model to allow for private information, which you might think about information gained by job search or talking to friends. And that can be proxied in various ways. I mean, you can proxy it from baseline characteristics and work outcomes. So we can call that here as Z, and in a levels equation, we can just place those proxies into the main equation, allowing delta therefore to represent the salience or relevance of that information. So the coefficient on the prior would then be lower. Or we can actually try and predict that private information from the same characteristics, giving us a private news shock. So you have a model in levels and a model in differences. As we show, they're effectively the same thing, so it's not particularly complicated. So what did we do in this analysis, in this study? So actually the main study was really a longitudinal tracking survey of graduates as they left the as they left education and went into the labor market. So we undertook a baseline survey in the final year of their undergraduate degrees and then tracked them subsequently for 18 months with quarterly follow-up telephone interviews. So we have 6 rounds of follow-ups and 1 baseline. So during the follow-up period, we then provided these individuals with information about the earnings of their peers. So we took information from the prior round of the survey, of the follow-up survey, relating to current incomes and current employment rates, and then provided that information back to the sample in different ways. So there were 3 specific types of messages we provided. The first was a general message, which was just the mean wage of the entire sample from the previous round. And the example in the box at the bottom of your screen is one example of the message we sent here in English, of course. So survey results at December 1st of all graduates in Mozambique, class of 2017, 59% are working and their average wage is 14,000 meticais per month. Sorry, yeah. Secondly, we did a university-specific message, which tailored the message basically based on the cohort of individuals from the same university. So if you attended the Universidade de Guatemala, you would receive the average wage of all graduates from that university. And then we did a field-specific message, which basically provided information for different courses of study, such as medicine, economics, and so on. So we tailored the message, and there's actually a 4th experimental or treatment arm where we mixed up these messages, providing the general, the university, and the field-specific message over at different points in time. Just to give you a sense here of the sample size and attrition. So as you can see here, we have the baseline up to round 6. I mean, the treatment only started in round 2, so I mean, we could, I guess, put everyone in the control in baseline in round 1. And as you can see, we started off, if you look at the total column there after all arms, we started off with 2,100, and in the final round, we had 1,849. So attrition of around 10 to 12% over the course of the survey over more than 2 years in total, which is pretty good. For these kinds of surveys. We did look at the extent to which attrition may be relevant or selective, and we did find that actually receiving the treatment reduced attrition, and we adjust the sample weights to take that into account following Chen, but the results are not sensitive to this whatsoever. So let's look at the results. So the results here, very simply, these are just empirical distributions of expected wages at baseline and end line. Here, the black line is the control group, and grouping all the treated individuals into one here. So there we see at the baseline, there's effectively no difference between the controlled and the treated, whereas at the end line, we do see a significant difference between the two distributions. So this is indicative of a change and a significantly larger downward shift in the end line expectations in the treatment group. I should point out here that the actual baseline wage expectations were revealed to be highly optimistic. This is the subject of a separate paper, which I'm showing on your screens there. But so as a result, we actually see everyone's expectations falling over time, but the end line, as you can see at the end line, the treated group show a larger reduction in their future wage expectations. So what we do now into the analysis, we start off again pretty simply, so putting aside the dynamics for a while, just to see basically whether this difference stands up in a regression context. And yes, it does. So this is a very standard difference in difference, or average treatment on the treated analysis, where we just have a dummy variable for either being treated or the specific treatment you receive. So in column 1, we just pull together the treated, and in column 1b, we separate out the different treatments. So this is just a dummy variable comparing end line and baseline expectations. So as we can see here, once we move into the final column, or the final two columns, where we add individual fixed effects and a range of controls, we see on average that the treated group saw their expected future earnings fall by around 15% more than in the control group, because these are now logs, these are log expectations. Or in fact, we see compared to the 5th survey round, so the time dummy for the last round there, this is around 50% more than in the control group. So expectations fell by 50% more than in the control group. So it's relatively large, you could say, from that perspective. Moving now to the dynamic analysis, the more interesting, I mean, again, we can obviously just treat the treatment as a dummy variable, but in the other two subcolumns, so for example, subcolumn 1b and 1c, we're now moving into the shock or the news component. So that's the SMS information minus the prior. And here we see an elasticity. So the coefficient there is the elasticity of wage expectations to unexpected news about peer earnings. And here we again see significant effects, so around a 6% elasticity in the short term. If we look across the different messages, overall, there is, they're all significant. There's some evidence that the field SMS message is slightly more robust and larger, although we can't state that statistically. So
5 minutes left.
We get the same for the first differences as well. The first differences estimations give essentially the same analysis. So almost to wrap up in a sense, we do it in the paper quite a lot of work in terms of looking at heterogeneous or asymmetric updating. So this is important in the literature as well. So in the first column here, for example, we look at whether positive news shocks are more salient than negative news shocks. And here we see no difference on average. So on average, positive and negative information or shocks about peer earnings seem to work in the same way. But if we actually look at this graphically, and in the paper we do this in a regression context as well, we see that there's actually much more stronger asymmetric responses to the general message as well as the field message, but not to the university message, which is interesting, and we discuss a bit about why that might be the case in the paper. We also look at a set of other differences. For example, with individuals, do individuals who are currently earning respond differently? And here we find no particular difference with respect to the public news information, so the peer earnings news, But we actually do find that for these individuals who are earning a wage, that their own wage shock, their own wage news, in a sense, they get a much more significant or much larger response to own earnings news in this case. So let me just conclude. What we find in Mozambique and in other contexts as well, there's systematically incorrect and here optimistic wage expectations. But we show that receiving SMS information about peer earnings did lead to moderate revisions in beliefs. So overall, a decline in the expected wage by around 15% over the course of 18 months, which is about double the control group, and a long-term response elasticity of around 16%. And for the field-specific message, we find the largest and most robust response. Well, we find evidence of complex updating heuristics, including asymmetric responses, but that's we go into that a lot more in the paper, so I'd encourage you to read that if you have time. So what are the implications from this? Well, we believe that detailed public wage information by occupation and education is likely to be valuable. It is clearly evident that individuals are not well informed about starting salaries for graduates, and that information of this kind does help them adjust their expectations. But at the same time, we must recognize that this is moderate in its effectiveness or in the impact. Many individuals continue to hold large, optimistic beliefs, and so information is not a general panacea for ensuring that the future wage expectations are aligned with the real distribution. I'll finish here, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sam, for a very interesting presentation with interesting policy implications. We now turn to the Q&A. I think we have a first question from one of our DPhil students here at CSAE. So Rocco Zizamia, can you please ask your question to Sam?
Rocco might be muted.
Perhaps just ask his question for him, Yasmine.
Yes. So the question is for Sam. Did you have any question in the surveys on reservation wage and or fair wage belief? If so, did updating wage expectation also affect reservation wage, fair wage belief?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. So the wage expectation that we elicited was a generic wage expectation. So, what is the wage you expect to be earning at date X? So we didn't elicit the reservation wage. I mean, unfortunately, I guess looking back on it, we would have. And actually, we've recently redone this experiment, but with a different group of students. And there we distinguished between the reservation wage and the own expected wage, which could be partly aspirational. So that is one potential explanation for the how would you put it, the kind of moderate effects we find are exactly the point that wage expectations that we're eliciting are partly aspirational. So that's definitely an issue, and it's actually pretty tricky to elicit wage expectations in a very rigorous way. So this is something that we've learned in the process, and actually in a current, a recent study that we've just undertaken, we've tried to kind of adapt the approach to see if that makes a difference. We haven't analyzed the data yet, so maybe watch this space and find out next year. Who knows?
Great, thanks, Sam. We'll watch the space.
So next we have a question from Giulio to Sam, I guess.
Thanks, Yasmine, and thanks, Sam, for the interesting presentation. So I just had a few questions, if I can. The first one was, do you have a sense of how expectations about labor market occupations also changed in the sample, as opposed to just looking at wages? And in particular, I was thinking, what is the self-employment occupation? How does that relate to wage employment? Is it generally thought to be better or worse? And then on the kind of still thinking about occupations, I'd be really interested to know how public versus private sector occupations, wage employments vary in Mozambique, and whether there are perhaps over optimism about getting hired in public employment in this context, or whether those are potentially not that high wage jobs in the public sector. So sorry, that was a streak of questions.
Yeah, that very good questions. We didn't actually, in this survey, we didn't track changes in expectations about the employer, but we did record that at the baseline, and then we do have a separate paper, and I'd be happy to share it with you, decomposing the difference between initial expected wages and final wage outcomes. So that's it's a separate paper, and there we do look at what you can call occupational mismatch and so on. And there it is. We do find that the kind of mismatch in terms of expected employment outcomes, so the sector of employment and so on and so forth, contributes a part of the labor, of this kind of the realized wage versus original wage expectation difference. The question is, what is the public-private difference? So in fact, we do find that many people would prefer to work in the private sector, interestingly enough, but end up in the public sector as a kind of a residual job, particularly in education and so on. So this is interesting for the kind of education and teacher labor market, is we find that people are often moving into that as a residual occupation, but then would prefer to move out when possible. We also find that self-employment is not something generally people wanted to undertake in the baseline, but more people ended up in self-employment in the end line. So I'd be happy to share that paper with you, because it does shed some light on some of these interesting dimensions. I mean, thinking about it would have been interesting to track changes in expected employer over time. But as you probably know, I mean, there are extreme limitations on how much you can actually get, particularly in telephone surveys. So we had to make some choices. But this is it's a good point. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we can wrap up for this session. Thank you very much to everyone for a very interesting presentation and question. So our conference will resume on Monday, which is a special event day. We have a mental health measurement for economics at 12, shaping the post-pandemic recovery in Africa at 2 p.m, and international collaboration in research project from PEDL matchmaking workshop. So please do join us, and I wish you all a restful weekend.